Listen, friend. What I'm about to tell you isn't some romanticized tale of cowboys and gunfights. No, this is about something far more dangerous than any outlaw's bullet, the kind of cold that could stop your heart before you even knew you were dying. Tonight, we're diving into a story that most people never hear about the Wild West. The story of how people actually survived those brutal winter nights when the temperature dropped so far below freezing that your spit would hit the ground as ice. Before we begin this journey together, I'd love to know, hit that like button if you're ready for a story that'll make you grateful for central heating, and subscribe if you want more untold tales from America's frontier. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm curious to know if you're bundled up somewhere warm, or if you're brave enough to listen to this on a cold night. Picture this. You're standing outside a log cabin in Dakota Territory, 1875. The wind isn't just blowing, it's screaming across the prairie like some ancient beast, carrying snow so fine and sharp it feels like needles against any exposed skin. Your breath doesn't just fog up. It crystallizes instantly, creating tiny ice particles that fall to the ground with the softest tinkling sound. This isn't the Hollywood version of the Wild West. This is the real frontier where survival meant more than being quick on the draw. Sarah Mitchell pulls her woolen shawl tighter as she hurries toward the cabin, where she and her family have spent the last 3 winters. The structure looks solid from the outside, but she knows better. Those logs were cut green and stacked fast because winter doesn't wait for proper carpentry. Between the timbers, she can see where they've stuffed moss, mud, and old rags into gaps that seem to grow wider each year as the wood shrinks and shifts. The door creaks on leather hinges as Sarah steps inside, bringing with her a swirl of snow that immediately begins melting on the dirt floor. The cabin's interior hits you with a wall of scent: wood smoke, damp wool, the sharp tang of tallow candles, and something else. Something animal and earthy. That would be the bear grease they've been rubbing on their boots and the buffalo robes that serve as both blankets and doors. Historical records from the mid-1800s show us that buffalo hides weren't luxury items, they were lifelines. Without them, settlers faced winter nights with little more protection than their cotton and wool clothing, which was woefully inadequate against Dakota winds that could slice through log walls as if they were made of paper. Inside the cabin, the Mitchell family has already begun their nightly ritual of survival. The father, Thomas, is banking the fire, carefully arranging logs so they'll burn slowly through the night without flaring too high, and risking the whole cabin going up in flames. His wife, Martha, spreads buffalo robes over the family's sleeping area, while their 3 children help arrange quilts that tell stories in every patch. These weren't just blankets. Look closer at that quilt and you'll see pieces cut from a wedding dress, strips from worn-out work shirts, squares salvaged from a child's outgrown coat. Each scrap was saved because nothing could be wasted on the frontier. The quilts were memory stitched into fabric, warmth drawn as much from love as from cotton batting. Young Timothy Mitchell, barely 8 years old, knows his job without being told. He gathers heated stones from the fire's edge, wrapping them carefully in old cloth before placing them at the foot of the family's shared sleeping area. These stone warmers were as essential as the fire itself, providing pockets of heat that could mean the difference between waking with all your toes or losing them to frostbite. Meanwhile, his sister Mary helps their mother arrange the sleeping spaces. There's no privacy on nights like this, no separate rooms or individual beds. The entire family will sleep together, pressed close for warmth, because human heat shared under hides and quilts was the only reliable source of warmth when the fire burned low. Historians debate whether families preferred this forced intimacy or simply endured it out of necessity. Some accounts suggest that the closeness strengthened family bonds, while others describe tensions that boiled over in the cramped quarters. Tonight, though, the Mitchells are focused on one thing: making it through to morning. As Sarah settles onto the straw tick, that's what they called their mattresses, large cloth sacks stuffed with dried grass and hay. She can feel every individual stalk poking through the thin linen. It's not comfortable by any modern standard, but it's warmer than sleeping on the frozen ground. The straw releases a faint scent of summer fields, a ghost of warmth in the depth of winter. The family bed is an elaborate construction of survival. First, the straw tick, then buffalo robes, then their precious quilts layered as thick as they can manage. Sarah's feet find the wrapped stone that Timothy placed there, and she sighs with relief as warmth spreads through her boots. But even as they settle in, everyone knows that sleep won't come easily. The cabin itself is alive with sound, logs groaning and popping as they contract in the cold, wind finding every crack and crevice, the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. These sounds tell stories too. The crack of a settling log means the cabin is holding together. The whistle of wind through chinking means cold air is seeping in. The howl of wolves, paradoxically, means safety, because when wolves are howling, they're far away. It's the silence that's dangerous. Thomas takes the first watch of the night. Someone always has to be awake to tend the fire, because letting it die means more than cold. It means death. He sits beside the hearth, adding logs carefully, watching the flames dance against the rough-hewn walls. The shadows they cast seem alive, stretching and shrinking like ghostly companions in the night. Contemporary accounts tell us that families often took turn through the night, each member rising to stoke the fire and ensure the wood supply lasted until dawn. Even children as young as Timothy were expected to take their shift, blinking away sleep as they poked the coals and added fuel. As the hours pass, the cabin tells its own story of survival. Frost begins forming on the inside of the walls where warm breath meets freezing air. It glitters like silver lace in the firelight, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. That frost means the temperature outside has dropped so low that even their body heat can't keep the interior walls from freezing. Martha Mitchell stirs as ice crystals begin forming on the rafters above their bed. She's seen this before, their own breath condensing and freezing in the air above them. Some families hung sheets or canvas beneath the roof beams to catch the frost before it could fall on sleeping children like indoor snow. Around midnight, it's Sarah's turn to take the watch. She rises carefully, trying not to wake her siblings, and makes her way to the fire. The stones at her feet have cooled, but the embers still glow with enough heat to warm her hands. She adds another log, watching sparks spiral up toward the crude chimney, and listens to the night outside. The wind has changed, bringing with it a different kind of cold. This is the kind of weather that kills, and Sarah knows it. She's heard the stories of families found frozen in their beds, of children who never woke up when the fire went out. Tonight, vigilance isn't just responsibility, it's survival. But the night holds other sounds too. From somewhere in the walls comes the soft scurrying of mice, also seeking warmth. Frontier cabins were never empty, no matter how carefully swept. Rodents, insects, and other small creatures shared these spaces, drawn by the same life-giving heat. Some families resigned themselves to this cohabitation, joking grimly that the cold made all creatures kin. Thomas's boots stand by the door, stuffed with grass for insulation. This was a trick learned from the indigenous peoples of the plains, who had perfected the art of winter survival long before European settlers arrived. Many Native American techniques, layered furs, insulated footwear, and even the design of shelters themselves, were gradually adopted by settlers who quickly learned that pride couldn't keep you warm. The stove in the corner pops as metal expands and contracts with the heat. It's a constant reminder of the fire's presence, but also of its danger. Countless records from the frontier describe cabins lost in seconds when sparks found their way to dry timber or straw. To sleep near the fire meant warmth, but it also meant constant vigilance. As Sarah tends the fire, she notices how the flame's light transforms the humble interior. The rough log walls glow golden, the patchwork quilts become rich tapestries, and even the humblest objects, a tin cup, a wooden spoon, a child's carved toy, seem precious in the amber glow. Fire wasn't just heat and light on the frontier, it was hope made visible. The hours stretch on, punctuated by the ritual of fire tending. Someone always rising, someone always watching, the family's survival maintained in shifts. Sleep comes in fragments between duties, between worries, between the sounds of the night. This is frontier sleep. Never complete, never safe. Always conditional on the next log, the next watch, the next hour survived. Outside, the world has transformed into an alien landscape. Snow has drifted so high against the cabin walls that it's begun to serve as insulation, sealing cracks and muffling the sounds of the night. What started as an enemy has become, in its way, an ally. The snow creates a natural barrier against the wind, and the cabin feels more secure, more contained. Some frontier families deliberately shoveled snow against their walls for insulation, understanding that not everything cold was an enemy. Those who lived in sod houses, structures dug into the earth and covered with thick layers of turf, often found that snow piled on their roofs created a second layer of insulation that turned their homes into snug earthen dens. Young Mary wakes as frost crystals patter down from the rafters like tiny rain. She's learned not to be frightened by this indoor weather. Instead, she traces patterns in the frost on the wall beside her bed, creating temporary art with her fingertip. Children on the frontier learn to find beauty in the harsh conditions that would terrify adults, seeing ice flowers instead of threats, shadow puppets instead of dangers. The smell of the cabin has deepened through the night. Smoke, wool, leather, and the faint sweetness of apples stored in sacks hanging from the rafters. Everything bears the scent of survival. Nothing purely decorative, nothing without purpose. Even the smells tell the story of a family making do with what they have. Around 3 a.m, Timothy takes his turn at the fire. His small hands shake as he arranges the logs, but he's learned the skill that could save his family's life. The flame flickers higher, casting dancing shadows across his serious young face. He's 8 years old and already understands responsibility that modern children might never know. As dawn begins to approach, the family experiences what many frontier families knew: the sensation of sleep divided into 2 parts. Historical records suggest that segmented sleep was common before the industrial age, with people naturally waking for a period in the middle of the night before returning to slumber. During this interval, conversations flowed softly, prayers were whispered, and sometimes neighbours even visited, trudging across snowy fields to share news. Martha wakes during this quiet time and notices that her husband is awake too. They whisper together in the darkness, planning the next day's work. sharing concerns about their food supplies, comforting each other with quiet words. These midnight conversations were often the only private moments couples could steal in the crowded confines of frontier life. The fire burns steadier now, fed by careful hands throughout the night. The cabin has found its rhythm, the rhythm of survival. Each family member has played their part in keeping the warmth alive, the cold at bay, the family safe until morning. This is how winter's nights were won on the frontier, not by grand gestures or heroic acts, but by patient vigilance, shared responsibility, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold. But not every cabin held the relative luxury of the Mitchell family's buffalo robes and adequate firewood. Down the valley, in what passes for the local town, other stories of winter survival were playing out in very different circumstances. The boarding house at the end of Main Street tells a different tale entirely. Here, 30 men crowd into rooms designed for half that number, sharing beds in shifts, breathing the same smoky air, and competing for space near the lone pot-bellied stove that struggles to heat the entire building. Jake Morrison, a miner down from the hills for the winter, finds himself pressed between two strangers in a bed that's seen better days. The man to his left snores like a freight train, while the one to his right mutters in his sleep in what sounds like German. The quilt they share is patched so many times it resembles a map more than a blanket, each repair telling the story of another winter survived. The air in the boarding house is thick with more than just smoke. Unwashed bodies, damp wool, tobacco, and the sharp scent of kerosene lamps create an atmosphere that would be suffocating if it weren't so necessary for warmth. Privacy is a luxury no one can afford when the temperature outside could kill you in minutes. Historical records show that these communal sleeping arrangements were breeding grounds for disease. Influenza, tuberculosis, and other illnesses spread quickly in the close quarters. But they also prevented deaths from freezing, providing shared body heat that individual cabins couldn't match. It was a trade-off between one kind of danger and another. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house keeper, makes her rounds through the night with a practiced eye. She knows which men are likely to cause trouble, which ones might need an extra blanket, and how to keep the stove fed without waking the entire house. Her own rest comes in fragments between responsibilities, much like the farm families scattered across the prairie. The sounds in the boarding house create their own symphony of survival. Snores, coughs, the creak of iron bed frames, the occasional groan of someone shifting position. Outside, the wind howls around the building's corners, but inside, the noise of human presence provides its own comfort. For men who might spend months alone in mining camps or isolated homesteads, even the sound of strangers breathing nearby could ease the psychological weight of frontier isolation. One curious detail from boarding house records involves the practice of hot bedding. Beds used in shifts, with one man sleeping during the night while another worked, then switching when the worker returned. The sheets rarely cooled, and privacy was non-existent, but it meant more men could find shelter when space was scarce. As the night progresses, Jake finds himself oddly comforted by the proximity of others. The stranger beside him might snore, but his warmth helps chase away the cold that seeps through the thin walls. The boarding house might lack the intimacy of family life, but it provides something else, proof that you're not alone in facing the brutal winter. Meanwhile, across town, the community church serves as another refuge for those who have nowhere else to go. Families whose cabins prove inadequate, travellers caught by unexpected storms, and the simply desperate find themselves gathered in the pews as Reverend Williams keeps the church stove burning through the night. The church's high ceiling means the heat rises away from the sleepers, but the large space accommodates more people than any cabin could hold. Families spread quilts between the pews, children sleep across wooden benches, and everyone finds comfort in shared vulnerability. The stained glass windows, such as they are in this frontier church, glow faintly with reflected firelight, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere of sanctuary. These communal sleeping spaces blur the boundaries between sacred and secular, between public and private. When survival is at stake, formality becomes a luxury few can afford. The church isn't just a place for Sunday worship, it's a lifeboat in the storm of winter, offering shelter to anyone who needs it. But perhaps the most remarkable stories of winter survival come from those who had perfected these techniques long before European settlers arrived. In lodges scattered across the plains, Native American families demonstrate winter survival skills honed over countless generations. Inside a Lakota teepee, the design itself tells a story of harmony with winter rather than war against it. The conical shape sheds wind and snow naturally, while the smoke hole at the top can be adjusted with poles to control both heat and ventilation. Buffalo hides cover the frame in layers, creating insulation that rivals modern materials. The family sleeps in a circle around the central fire, heads toward the warmth, feet radiating outward. Children disappear completely under layers of fur, their laughter muffled before sleep claims them. Cedar boughs line the sleeping area, releasing a sharp, pleasant scent that masks smoke and provides cushioning against the frozen ground. This isn't improvised survival, it's engineered comfort based on centuries of experience. Every element of the lodge serves multiple purposes. The hides provide insulation and rain protection. The central fire warms all sleepers equally, and the circular design distributes heat evenly while allowing smoke to escape naturally. Storytelling accompanies the ritual of bedding down. An elder's voice weaves myths and legends as blankets are adjusted and fire embers stirred. Sleep here isn't just about physical survival, it's also a sacred time guarded by stories and ritual. The voice of the storyteller becomes a lullaby, carrying listeners from waking into dreams on a river of words. The contrast couldn't be sharper between the settler families struggling in their drafty cabins and the indigenous families resting in structures specifically designed for harsh winters. One approach fights against the season, while the other works with it, turning even snow into an ally rather than an enemy. Yet despite the differences in shelter and technique, all these stories share common threads: the primacy of fire, the necessity of vigilance, the value of shared warmth, and the understanding that winter sleep on the frontier was never guaranteed, never comfortable, but always precious. As the long night continues across the prairie, each family, each household, each individual finds their own way to negotiate with the cold. Some succeed through preparation and skill, others through sheer stubborn endurance, and still others through the kindness of neighbours and the strength of community. The Mitchell family, back in their cabin, experiences the deep quiet that comes after midnight when even the wind seems to pause. This is when frost forms most heavily on the windows, when the fire's heat creates the sharpest contrast with the cold outside, when sleep finally comes in something approaching peace. Sarah shifts under the buffalo robe, feeling the warmth of her family beside her. Timothy's stone has cooled, but his small body radiates heat like a tiny furnace. Martha's breathing is steady and deep, the rhythm of someone who has learned to rest when rest is possible. Thomas continues his watch by the fire, but even he dozes occasionally, starting awake whenever a log shifts or the wind gusts particularly hard. The straw beneath them rustles with every movement, releasing that faint scent of summer grasslands. It's scratchy and imperfect, but it's warmer than the bare ground, and on a night like this that makes all the difference. Comfort isn't luxury here, it's simply the absence of immediate danger. Outside, the storm has settled into a steady rhythm. Snow continues to fall, muffling the world in white silence. The wind still blows, but without the fierce gusts that marked the early evening. Even the wolves have fallen quiet, either finding their own shelter or moving on to other hunting grounds. Inside the cabin, the family has achieved what passes for peace on the frontier. Not safety, that's never guaranteed, but a fragile equilibrium between human will and natural force. The fire burns, the walls hold, and sleep comes in waves between the duties of survival. As Thomas adds another log to the fire, sparks spiral up toward the chimney, carrying with them tiny prayers of gratitude. Another night survived, another morning within reach. The log catches, flames licking higher, and warmth spreads through the small space like a blessing. The smell of pine resin fills the air as fresh sap bubbles and burns. Even now, months after the trees were cut, they're still giving up their essence to keep this family alive. The logs themselves tell stories, growth rings marking good years and bad, scars from storms and fires, the patient accumulation of wood that would become, in this moment, the difference between life and death. Young Mary stirs in her sleep, dreaming perhaps of the summer days when this straw was growing green in distant fields, when the buffalo whose hide covers her was roaming free across endless grasslands, when the trees that now warm her were standing tall against blue skies. Her dreams carry her away from the cold into seasons of plenty and warmth. Timothy doesn't dream at all. He sleeps the deep, exhausted sleep of childhood, his body finally surrendering to fatigue after the long day of winter chores. His small hands, still bearing the calluses of work beyond his years, curl under the quilt like small animals seeking warmth. Martha dreams of spring, of the garden she'll plant if they all make it through the winter, of fresh vegetables and the luxury of stepping outside without bundling in layers of wool and hide. In her dreams, the wind carries the scent of growing things instead of snow and ice. But Thomas doesn't sleep. He watches the fire with the vigilance of someone who understands that this flame is all that stands between his family and the cold. He counts logs, estimating how long their supply will last. He listens to the wind, gauging whether the storm is strengthening or weakening. He watches his family sleep and feels the weight of their trust, their dependence on his ability to keep the fire alive. This is the burden and the privilege of survival on the frontier, the knowledge that your actions, your vigilance, your careful tending of flame and fuel and warmth directly determine whether the people you love will see another sunrise. The night deepens, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, begins its slow turn toward dawn. The fire has burned lower, the cabin has grown colder, but the family has endured. They've negotiated another truce with winter, bought another day of life with their vigilance and their shared warmth. As the first faint hint of grey light begins to filter through the frost-covered window, Sarah wakes to the familiar ritual of morning on the frontier. The fire must be rebuilt, clothes must be warmed before putting them on, and the daily work of survival must begin again. But they've made it. Another night survived, another morning reached. The frost on the windows has grown thick during the night, etching delicate patterns that catch the early light like artwork made of ice. Children often traced these patterns with their fingers, creating temporary art that would melt with the day's first warming. Even in the harshest conditions, beauty could be found by those who knew how to look for it. Steam rises from the coffee pot as Thomas places it near the fire. The bitter brew is thin and weak. Coffee beans are precious on the frontier, but it's warm, and warmth is what matters. The smell joins the complex perfume of the cabin. Smoke, wool, leather, pine, and the indefinable scent of lives lived in close proximity to survival. One by one, the family stirs to consciousness. Martha stretches carefully, mindful of joints stiffened by cold and the unforgiving surface of the straw tick. The children wake slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth of their shared nest for the demands of another day. But wake they do, because that's what survival demands. Another morning faced, another day's work begun, another night's rest earned through the simple act of enduring. The Wild West wasn't won in gunfights or gold rushes. It was won in moments like this, families rising from inadequate beds in inadequate shelters to face inadequate supplies, and somehow, through determination and mutual support, making it enough. The fire catches properly now, flames rising bright and cheerful, promising warmth for the tasks ahead. The frost on the windows begins to melt, creating clear patches that reveal the white world outside. The storm has passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow, but somehow made more beautiful by its burden. As the family begins their morning routine, checking the fire, warming clothes, preparing what passes for breakfast, they carry with them the knowledge that they've won another small victory against the winter. Not through conquest, but through endurance. Not by defeating the cold, but by refusing to surrender to it. This is the true story of winter on the frontier. Not the dramatic tales of shootouts and cattle drives, but the quiet heroism of families like the Mitchells, making do with what they have, sharing what little warmth they can create, and finding the strength to face another day in a land that demands everything and gives back only what can be wrested from it through courage, ingenuity, and the simple refusal to give up. The morning light grows stronger, filtering through melting frost, warming log walls and falling across faces marked by another night's survival. Outside, the world gleams white and pristine, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Inside, the fire burns bright. The family moves with purpose, and life continues its ancient dance with winter. Soon they'll venture outside to check on livestock, to gather wood, to mend whatever the storm has broken. But for now, for this moment, they rest in the knowledge that they've survived another night. The cabin holds, the fire burns, and the family endures. As our journey through this frontier night comes to an end, let yourself sink back into your own warm bed, your own safe shelter. Feel the softness of modern comfort, the reliability of central heating, the security of walls that don't groan and shift with every change in weather, but carry with you also the knowledge of what came before. The families who faced the darkness with nothing but fire and will, who found warmth in shared breath and shared burden, who discovered that survival isn't just about enduring hardship, but about finding grace in the act of endurance itself. Close your eyes now, and let the memory of their courage warm you. Let the echo of their stories guide you into your own rest, secure in the knowledge that the human spirit, when tested by winter's worst, doesn't just survive. It finds ways to kindle warmth in the coldest darkness, to create comfort from the simplest materials, and to discover that even in the harshest conditions, we are never truly alone. Sleep now, as they finally could when dawn broke over the frontier, with gratitude for warmth, for safety, for the simple miracle of another night survived, and another morning reached. The Wild West winter has passed into memory, but the courage it demanded lives on in the very fact that you are here to remember it. Rest well, knowing that somewhere in your past, families like the Mitchells faced the dark with nothing but determination, and each other, and through their endurance, made possible the comfort you know today. Let their vigil watch over your dreams, and sleep deeply in the warmth they fought so hard to preserve. Sweet dreams, and remember, every comfortable night you spend is built on the foundation of those who learn to find rest in the midst of the storm, warmth in the depths of cold, and hope in the simple act of keeping the fire burning until dawn. But our story isn't finished yet. There are more tales to tell, more nights to survive, more lessons to learn from those who came before us. Let me take you deeper into this world of frontier winters, where every breath was a victory and every sunrise a miracle. The Mitchell cabin isn't the only story being written across this frozen landscape tonight. Miles away, in a settlement that barely deserves the name of town, other dramas of survival are unfolding. The general store, with its thick stone walls and iron stove, has become an unofficial refuge for anyone caught by the storm. But even here, in what passes for civilization, the night brings its own challenges. Margaret O'Sullivan, the storekeeper's wife, moves through the crowded space with practiced efficiency. She's seen nights like this before, nights when the temperature drops so low that exposed skin freezes in minutes, when the wind carries snow like shards of glass, when the very air seems to turn solid with cold. Tonight, her store shelters not just her own family, but 3 travelling salesmen, a family of homesteaders whose cabin roof collapsed under the weight of snow, and an elderly preacher who was caught on the road when the storm hit. The store's layout tells its own story of adaptation to frontier life. Barrels of flour and salt line the walls, their contents as precious as gold when supply wagons can't make it through. Shelves hold bolts of wool and canvas, needles and thread, the tools of survival disguised as merchandise. But tonight, these commercial goods become the building blocks of temporary shelter as Margaret arranges sleeping spaces between the aisles. The Henriksen family, Henrik, his wife Astrid, and their twin boys Eric and Lars, huddle near the store's back corner where Margaret has spread canvas over the flour barrels to create a makeshift sleeping area. These Norwegian immigrants understand cold in their bones, but the prairie winter is different from anything they knew in the old country. There, they had generations of accumulated knowledge, forests full of properly seasoned timber, and communities with deep roots. Here they're learning survival one bitter night at a time. Henrik examines the store's iron stove with the eye of a man who understands that fire is life. The stove is larger than anything in their collapsed cabin, its iron body radiating heat in waves that reach farther than any fireplace could manage. But feeding it requires constant attention, and the supply of coal is limited. Margaret rations it carefully, adding fuel only when the temperature inside begins to drop dangerously low. The salesman, Walter Jenkins, a patent medicine peddler from St. Louis, Tom Brady, who sells farming equipment when farmers can afford it, and Samuel Morrison, purveyor of books and writing supplies, represent the commercial arteries that keep frontier communities alive. But tonight, their sample cases and order books are forgotten as they contribute what they can to the communal effort of surviving until dawn. Walter has a small flask of whiskey, which he shares not for conviviality but for the brief illusion of warmth it provides. Historical accounts from the period frequently mention alcohol as a winter survival tool. though we now know it actually makes the body lose heat faster while creating a dangerous sense of warmth. Still, on a night when psychological comfort might be as important as physical warmth, even false hope has value. Tom contributes his expertise with the stove, understanding how to regulate airflow and coal consumption to maximize heat while conserving fuel. His hands, calloused from years of handling iron farm equipment, work the stove's dampers and vents with the skill of someone who knows that fire is both servant and master on the frontier. Samuel, perhaps surprisingly, contributes stories. In a world without electric lights or radio, without newspapers that arrive regularly or libraries within reach, stories become sustenance for the mind. His voice rises and falls as he recounts tales from the books he's read, from the places he's travelled, from the people he's met in his wanderings across the frontier. The stories serve a practical purpose too. They keep minds occupied, prevent the kind of despair that can kill as surely as cold. The preacher, Reverend Josiah Blackwood, adds his own form of comfort. His prayers are practical things, not flowery petitions, but simple requests for warmth, for safety, for the strength to see morning. His presence reminds everyone that they're not just individuals fighting separate battles against the cold, but a community bound together by shared vulnerability. As the night deepens, the store becomes a microcosm of frontier society. Class distinctions matter less when everyone's breath fogs in the air. The well-dressed salesman shares space with the dirt-poor homesteader. The educated preacher sleeps beside the illiterate immigrant farmer. And the store owner treats all with equal consideration, because on nights like this, survival is the only currency that matters. The children, Eric and Lars Henriksen, along with little Mary O'Sullivan and the youngest Henriksen daughter, Greta, adapt to the unusual circumstances with the resilience that children seem to possess naturally. They play quiet games between the store aisles, building forts from bolts of cloth, creating stories about the storm outside. Their laughter, though subdued by the circumstances, adds a note of hope to the adult conversations dominated by practical concerns about fuel and food and the likelihood of rescue. Margaret watches them play and remembers her own childhood winters in Ohio, where storms were fierce but rarely deadly, where homes were built with proper foundations and adequate heating, where winter was an inconvenience rather than a mortal enemy. The frontier has taught her that childhood here means growing up fast, learning early that comfort is temporary and survival requires constant vigilance. The store's inventory becomes a catalogue of frontier necessities laid bare by crisis. Woolen blankets, marked for sale at premium prices, are distributed freely tonight because Margaret understands that dead customers buy nothing. Candles, normally rationed to prevent waste, burn freely because darkness breeds panic more surely than light breeds fire. Even precious sugar finds its way into the communal pot of coffee that Tom keeps brewing throughout the night, because warmth and comfort come in many forms. But it's the less obvious items that tell the deeper story of frontier life. The patent medicines that Walter sells, tonics and elixirs promising everything from hair growth to eternal youth, represent hope in liquid form for people who live too far from real doctors. Tonight his small bottles of laudanum serve their most honest purpose, dulling the pain of joints aching from cold and bodies pushed beyond their limits. Tom's farming equipment catalogues, normally used to sell ploughs and harvesters to optimistic homesteaders, become fuel for the fire when coal runs low. The irony isn't lost on anyone. Tools meant to help tame the land are consumed to survive its fury. Each page that burns represents someone's dream of agricultural success, but tonight survival trumps ambition. Samuel's books face the same fate, though he chooses carefully which volumes to sacrifice. A dime novel about frontier adventure goes into the flames without hesitation. Reality has proven more dramatic than any fiction. But he guards his copy of Whitman's poems jealously, understanding that some forms of sustenance are worth preserving even at the cost of warmth. As midnight approaches, the temporary community in the general store settles into the rhythm of survival that frontier people know instinctively. Someone must always be awake to tend the fire. Someone must watch for signs that the storm is weakening or strengthening. Someone must monitor the fuel supply and calculate how long it might last. The watches are divided not by gender or age or social standing, but by practical considerations. Margaret knows her store best and can navigate it in the dark. Henrik understands fire and fuel from his years of farming. Walter, despite his profession as a seller of questionable remedies, has genuine experience with people in extremis and can recognize the signs of hypothermia or frostbite before they become fatal. The conversations during the night watches reveal the human cost of frontier life in ways that daylight interactions rarely do. Henrik speaks of the farm he left in Norway, where his family had lived for 6 generations, where every field had a name and every tradition had deep roots. He talks about the decision to leave it all behind for the promise of free land in America, and the growing understanding that freedom comes with prices he hadn't anticipated. Margaret shares memories of her wedding day, when she wore a dress of white silk that would be impossible to keep clean for a single day in this environment. That dress, carefully preserved in a trunk upstairs, represents not just her past, but her hope that someday, somehow, this harsh land might soften enough to allow such luxuries again. Walter's stories are different. Tales of the road, of customers met in remote settlements, of the desperation he sees in the eyes of people who've bet everything on the frontier and aren't sure they've made the right choice. His patent medicines may be mostly alcohol and sugar water, but he's learned that sometimes hope is the most potent medicine of all. The preacher speaks of faith tested by hardship, of prayers that seem to echo unheard in the vast emptiness of the prairie, of the challenge of finding God's presence in a landscape that seems designed to humble human ambition. But he also talks about the moments of grace he's witnessed, acts of kindness between strangers, courage in the face of impossible odds, love that persists despite conditions that test every bond. As the night progresses, the store becomes a confessional of sorts. People share fears they'd never voice in daylight, dreams they're afraid to admit even to themselves, regrets about choices that can't be undone. The storm outside creates a strange intimacy among these temporary shelter mates, a sense that normal social rules are suspended when survival is at stake. Young Erik Henriksen, barely 10 years old, reveals that he dreams every night of the farm in Norway, of the streams where he caught fish with his grandfather, of the forest paths he knew like the lines on his own palm. His twin brother Lars admits that he can barely remember Norway at all, that America's the only home he really knows, but that he's terrified this home might kill them all before they can grow up. Astrid Henriksen speaks in broken English about the letters she writes to her sister back in Norway, letters that paint the frontier experience in glowing terms, because admitting the truth might break her heart, or her sister's. She talks about the garden she plans to plant in spring, if they survive the winter, if their claim on the land holds, if the dreams that brought them here prove stronger than the reality that tests them daily. Little Mary O'Sullivan, Margaret's daughter, listens to these adult confessions with the wide-eyed attention of childhood, absorbing lessons about life that no school could teach. She's learning that adults don't have all the answers, that grown-ups are as frightened and uncertain as children sometimes, that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to keep going despite it. The storm outside intensifies as the night deepens, wind howling around the store's stone walls with a fury that seems almost personal. Snow drives against the windows with such force that the glass vibrates, creating a constant percussion that underscores every conversation. The building itself groans under the assault, timbers creaking and settling as temperature changes stress every joint and nail. Inside, the community of survivors has organized itself with the efficiency that frontier life demands. Sleeping areas are arranged to maximize shared warmth while maintaining minimal privacy. The single stove provides the only heat source, so sleeping positions are negotiated based on need. The children and elderly closest to warmth, the healthiest adults willing to endure the cooler spots near the walls. Food becomes a community resource managed with careful deliberation. Margaret's store inventory includes crackers, canned goods, dried fruits, and other non-perishables. But winter storms can last for days, and rescue might be delayed even longer. Every meal is calculated against an unknown duration of confinement, every portion weighed against the possibility that tomorrow might bring no relief. The social dynamics that emerge during this enforced intimacy reveal truths about frontier life that normal circumstances might hide. Class distinctions, so important in established Eastern communities, become almost meaningless when everyone faces the same mortal threat. The well-educated preacher defers to the Norwegian farmer's expertise with fire management. The sophisticated traveling salesman accepts instruction from the immigrant woman about conserving food supplies. But tensions exist too. Space is limited, privacy non-existent, and the stress of uncertain survival can fray even well-intentioned relationships. Walter's patent medicines include a significant amount of alcohol, and some of the men eye his supplies with interest that goes beyond medicinal need. Margaret must navigate between maintaining community harmony and protecting resources that might mean the difference between survival and disaster. The children become barometers of the group's emotional state. When the adults manage to maintain optimism and cooperation, the children play quietly, sometimes even laughing at their improvised games. But when tensions rise among the grown-ups, the children become silent and watchful, picking up on anxieties that the adults try to hide. As the long night continues, the store's transformation from commercial space to survival shelter becomes complete. Bolts of cloth have become bedding, flour barrels serve as seats and tables, and the carefully arranged merchandise has been reorganized into the geography of emergency habitation. The change represents more than mere adaptation. It symbolizes the frontier experience itself, where intended purposes yield to immediate necessities, where plans bend to circumstances, where survival requires constant improvisation. Meanwhile, across the storm-ravaged prairie, other stories of winter survival unfold in settings that range from desperate to ingenious. Not everyone has the relative luxury of a well-built store with a good stove and adequate supplies. Some face the night with nothing but their own resourcefulness and the stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold. In a dugout carved into a hillside 10 miles from the settlement, the Morrison family, no relation to the salesman Samuel Morrison, represents another adaptation to frontier life. Their soddy is built into the earth itself, walls and roof constructed from thick chunks of prairie sod stacked like enormous bricks. From the outside it's almost invisible, looking more like a natural hill than a human dwelling. But inside it's surprisingly warm and secure. James Morrison understood something that many homesteaders learned too late. Fighting the prairie environment is a losing battle, but working with it can provide security that more conventional construction methods can't match. His dugout stays naturally cool in summer and warm in winter, the earth itself providing insulation that log cabins can't match. The thick sod walls don't burn, don't rot, and don't shift with temperature changes the way timber does. His wife, Catherine, initially hated the dugout's primitive appearance, and the way dirt occasionally crumbled from the ceiling into her cooking pot. But she's learned to appreciate the steady temperature, the protection from wind, and the sense of security that comes from living in harmony with the landscape rather than in opposition to it. Their 3 children, James Jr., aged 12, Rebecca, 10, and little David, just 6, have adapted to dugout life with the flexibility of youth. They've learned to love the way the thick walls muffle outside noise, creating a sense of cozy isolation even in the worst storms. Tonight, as wind screams across the prairie above them, they're snug in their underground home, playing quiet games by the light of a single oil lamp. The dugout's heating system is elegantly simple. A small stove vented through a chimney that extends above ground level, with the earth walls retaining and radiating heat throughout the small space. James built the chimney with stones gathered from a creek bed, mortared with clay mixed with grass for binding. It's not beautiful by conventional standards, but it works, and on the frontier, function matters more than form. Catherine has made the dugout's interior as comfortable as possible within the constraints of their circumstances. Muslin stretched across the ceiling prevents dirt from falling into the living space. Wooden shelves built by James from lumber carefully hoarded from their wagon hold their few books, dishes, and precious family photographs. A curtain made from an old sheet divides the single room into sleeping and living areas, providing the illusion of privacy in a space barely larger than a modern bedroom. The dugout's most remarkable feature might be its root cellar, a smaller space carved deeper into the hill, where the family stores food supplies that won't freeze even in the worst weather. Potatoes, apples, preserved meats, and other foods stay at a constant temperature just above freezing, protected by the Earth's natural insulation. It's a storage system that many modern preppers might envy, but living underground has its own challenges that test the family's resourcefulness daily. Moisture is a constant problem, with condensation from cooking and breathing creating dampness that can ruin food or clothing if not carefully managed. Catherine has learned to hang wet items near the stove in precise arrangements that dry them without creating fire hazards or blocking heat circulation. Ventilation requires constant attention. Too little air exchange and the family risks suffocation from stove smoke or carbon monoxide. Too much ventilation and precious heat escapes to the outside. James has built an ingenious system of vents that can be opened or closed depending on wind direction and intensity, allowing him to fine-tune the dugout's atmosphere. The psychological challenges of underground living are as real as the physical ones. The dugout has only one small window, built at ground level and often blocked by snow in winter. Days can pass without natural light, creating a cave-like existence that can wear on spirits already strained by isolation and hardship. The family combats this with rituals that mark time and maintain connection to the outside world. Morning prayers at sunrise, evening stories by lamplight, weekly baths that serve as much to maintain morale as cleanliness. Tonight, as the storm rages overhead, the Morrison family gathers around their small table for an evening meal that stretches their food supplies, while providing comfort beyond mere nutrition. Catherine has made a stew from preserved beef, potatoes from their root cellar, and dried beans carefully hoarded since their last trip to town. The smell fills the small space with warmth and the promise of satisfaction, even if portions are smaller than anyone would prefer. The children help with practiced efficiency that would impress adults in more civilized settings. James Jr. tends the fire with the skill of someone who understands that fuel conservation might mean the difference between life and death. Rebecca helps her mother serve the meal, careful not to waste a single drop of the precious stew. Little David sets the table with their few pieces of good china, treating the simple meal as a formal occasion worthy of their best efforts. These dinner rituals serve purposes beyond mere sustenance. They maintain family bonds in circumstances that could easily fragment relationships. They preserve civilized behavior in a setting that could encourage abandonment of social norms. They create predictability and comfort in lives dominated by uncertainty and hardship. After the meal, the family gathers around the stove for their evening's entertainment. Books are precious on the frontier, but the Morrisons have managed to preserve a small collection that serves as their library, theatre, and connection to the wider world. Tonight, James reads aloud from a volume of Dickens while Catherine mends clothes, and the children work on lessons that will prepare them for whatever future this harsh land might offer. The reading serves multiple purposes beyond entertainment. It maintains the family's connection to literature and culture that frontier isolation might otherwise erode. It provides shared experiences that bind the family together. It fills the long winter evenings with activity that keeps minds engaged and spirits elevated. Young Rebecca follows along in her own worn copy of the same book, practicing reading skills that her mother insists she maintain despite the absence of formal schooling. Education on the frontier is often a family responsibility, with parents serving as teachers for children who might not see the inside of a real school for years. James Jr. works on arithmetic problems that his father has created based on practical frontier challenges, calculating how much grain to feed livestock, determining how many acres can be ploughed in a day, figuring out how long food supplies will last at various consumption rates. These aren't abstract academic exercises, but survival skills disguised as education. Little David draws pictures on a slate, creating scenes from his imagination that mix memories of their former life in Ohio with dreams of what their prairie farm might become. His drawings show houses with glass windows, gardens full of vegetables, and livestock grazing in green fields. Visions of a future that may or may not materialize, but that sustain hope through the harsh present. As the evening progresses, the dugout becomes a cocoon of human warmth and activity, protected from the storm by thick earth walls and sustained by the family's determination to maintain civilization in the midst of wilderness. The contrast with the fury outside is stark. Wind that could knock a man down, snow that could bury a cabin, cold that could freeze flesh in minutes, all held at bay by the Morrison family's understanding of how to work with their environment rather than against it. The dugout's success as a survival strategy extends beyond mere weather protection. It represents a different philosophy of frontier life, one that embraces adaptation rather than domination, that seeks harmony with the landscape rather than conquest of it, that finds security in understanding and working with natural forces rather than in trying to overcome them through brute force. This philosophy shapes every aspect of the Morrison family's approach to frontier living. They plant crops that thrive in prairie conditions rather than fighting to grow varieties that worked in Ohio. They raise livestock that can survive on native grasses rather than importing feed at enormous expense. They build their home into the earth rather than trying to impose foreign architectural styles on an unforgiving landscape. But even the most successful adaptation can't eliminate all risks. The dugout protects against wind and cold, but it's vulnerable to flooding if spring rains are heavy or if snow melts too quickly. The earth walls that provide such excellent insulation can collapse if they become too saturated with moisture. The underground location that offers such security can become a trap if the entrance becomes blocked by snow or debris. James checks the dugout's structural integrity regularly, looking for signs of stress or weakness that might warn of impending problems. He's reinforced critical areas with timber scavenged from abandoned homesteads, creating a hybrid structure that combines the best features of sod construction with the strength of wooden framing. Catherine monitors the family's health with the vigilance of someone who understands that medical help is days away even in good weather. She watches for signs of scurvy, rickets, or other diseases that can develop when fresh foods are scarce. Her small collection of herbs and home remedies represents the frontier family's first and often only line of defense against illness. The children's education continues even in the depths of winter, not just in reading and arithmetic, but in the practical skills that frontier life demands. James Jr. learns carpentry, blacksmithing, and animal husbandry by helping his father with daily chores. Rebecca masters cooking, sewing, and household management by assisting her mother. David develops the observation skills and physical toughness that frontier life requires through games and activities that older children design for him. As midnight approaches in the Morrison dugout, the family settles into their evening routine with the ease of long practice. The stove is banked for overnight burning, with carefully arranged wood and coal that will provide heat without dangerous flare-ups. Clothing is arranged for quick dressing if emergency arises. Water containers are placed where they won't freeze but won't spill if someone stumbles in the dark. The sleeping arrangements in the dugout reflect both the practical necessities of space conservation and the emotional needs of family cohesion. Parents and children sleep close together, sharing warmth and providing mutual comfort against the isolation of prairie life. Privacy is a luxury that must yield to survival requirements, but the family has learned to create emotional privacy through respect and consideration even in close quarters. Meanwhile, in the settlement's church building, Reverend Williams faces his own challenges as the unofficial keeper of the community's emergency shelter. The church's high ceiling and large windows make it harder to heat than smaller buildings, but its solid construction and central location make it the natural gathering place for those who need refuge from the storm. The Reverend is a practical man who understands that his ministry extends far beyond Sunday sermons. Tonight his congregation includes not just his regular parishioners, but anyone who needs shelter, travelling merchants caught by the storm, homesteaders whose cabins have failed, and town residents whose own homes lack adequate heating. His church has become an ark in the flood of winter weather. The building itself tells the story of a community's aspirations and limitations. The wooden frame construction represents the settlers' desire to recreate the familiar architecture of their former homes in the East. But the materials are frontier materials, rough-hewn lumber from local trees, windows that are smaller and fewer than those in established churches, heating provided by a wood stove rather than the coal furnaces that Eastern churches might afford. The church's furnishings reflect the community's resourcefulness and the reality of frontier economics. Pews are built from local timber by community members rather than purchased from specialized furniture makers. The altar is constructed from the same rough lumber as the walls, given dignity by careful workmanship rather than expensive materials. Stained glass windows are few and simple, but they catch and reflect the light from oil lamps and candles, creating beauty from humble materials. Tonight those pews serve as beds for anyone who needs them. Families spread quilts and blankets across the wooden benches, creating makeshift sleeping spaces that offer more comfort than the alternative of facing the storm outside. The church's central aisle becomes a thoroughfare for those tending the fire, checking on children, or simply moving around to prevent their muscles from stiffening in the cold. Reverend Williams moves through his transformed sanctuary with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. He checks on elderly parishioners who are most vulnerable to cold, ensures that children are warm and secure, and mediates the small disputes that can arise when stressed people are forced into close proximity. His presence provides not just spiritual comfort, but practical leadership that helps the temporary community function smoothly. The church's role as emergency shelter reflects a broader truth about frontier communities. Institutions must serve multiple functions to justify their existence in an environment where resources are scarce and needs are many. The church building hosts not only religious services but community meetings, school classes, social gatherings, and emergency shelter. Its value to the community extends far beyond its spiritual function. Mrs. Elena Kowalski, a Polish immigrant whose husband works in the territorial capital, sits with her 2 young daughters near the church's stove. She speaks little English, but her actions communicate clearly as she helps distribute blankets and shares her small supply of food with other families. Her presence illustrates the international character of frontier communities, where survival concerns transcend language and cultural barriers. The Kowalski girls, Anna and Marie, play quietly with cornhusk dolls that their mother made from materials that would otherwise have been discarded. These simple toys represent the frontier parents' challenge of providing childhood comforts from whatever materials are available. The dolls are crude by commercial standards, but they're treasured by children who understand that such luxuries are rare and precious. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the settlement's physician, makes his rounds among the church's temporary residents with the focused attention of someone who knows that minor problems can become major emergencies when medical resources are limited. He checks for signs of frostbite, hypothermia, or respiratory problems that could develop in the crowded, smoky environment. His medical bag contains remedies that represent the state of frontier medicine: morphine for severe pain, quinine for fever, and various herbs and compounds for treating common ailments. The doctor's presence provides reassurance that goes beyond his actual ability to treat serious medical emergencies. In a community where the nearest hospital might be hundreds of miles away, having any medical training available offers psychological comfort that can be as important as actual treatment. Dr. Harrison understands this and makes himself visible and available throughout the night, even when there's little he can actually do to improve conditions. Young couples find themselves thrown together by the emergency shelter situation in ways that might not occur under normal circumstances. Social conventions that normally govern interactions between unmarried men and women become relaxed when survival takes precedence over propriety. These forced intimacies sometimes lead to romances that might never have developed under more formal social conditions. Sarah Peterson, a schoolteacher boarding with the minister's family, finds herself sharing sleeping space with the Kowalski family due to space limitations. Despite the language barrier, she and Mrs. Kowalski discover ways to communicate through gestures, shared tasks, and the universal language of caring for children. The emergency situation creates bonds that might last long after the storm passes. The church's transformation into emergency shelter reveals both the strengths and limitations of frontier community resources. The building itself is adequate: solid construction, reasonable heating capacity, and enough space for the settlement's population. But supplies are limited, privacy is non-existent, and comfort is minimal. The arrangement works for short-term emergencies, but would become increasingly problematic if the situation extended for days or weeks. Food becomes a carefully managed resource as the night progresses. Each family contributes what they can to a common supply that's distributed based on need rather than contribution. Children and elderly receive priority, followed by those whose work is essential for community survival. It's a system that reflects frontier values of mutual support and practical priority setting. The church's heating system struggles to warm the large space adequately. The single wood stove, adequate for regular Sunday services, works overtime to provide heat for dozens of people throughout the night. Reverend Williams and the other men take turns feeding the fire, carefully managing fuel consumption to ensure the supply lasts until morning. As the night deepens, the church becomes a microcosm of frontier society dealing with crisis. Class distinctions become less important than practical contributions. The banker's wife shares tasks with the immigrant farmer's daughter. The travelling salesman defers to the local blacksmith's expertise about fire management. Social hierarchies yield to the democracy of shared vulnerability. The children adapt to the unusual circumstances with the resilience that makes them natural frontiers people. They create games from their confined situation, tell stories to entertain younger children, and help adults with tasks that are within their capabilities. Their ability to find joy and entertainment in difficult circumstances provides a model for adult behavior and helps maintain community morale. Prayer takes on special significance in the emergency shelter situation. Reverend Williams leads evening prayers that focus on gratitude for shelter, safety, and community, rather than petitions for rescue or relief. The prayers acknowledge the severity of their situation while affirming faith in their ability to endure whatever the night brings. The church's role as information center becomes crucial as the storm progresses. People share news about family members who might be stranded elsewhere, discuss the condition of outlying homesteads, and speculate about when travel might again be possible. The building becomes the community's nerve center for tracking who is safe and who might need help once the storm passes. As midnight approaches, the church settles into the quiet rhythm of people trying to rest in difficult circumstances. Conversations become whispers, movements become more careful to avoid disturbing others, and the focus shifts from active survival to passive endurance. The night is far from over, but the community has achieved a fragile stability that offers hope for making it through to morning. But not everyone in the region has access to the relative security of the general store, the Morrison dugout, or the church shelter. Scattered across the prairie, isolated homesteaders face the storm with only their own resources and whatever shelter they've managed to create. Some will survive through careful preparation and skillful adaptation. Others will learn harsh lessons about the cost of underestimating prairie winter's fury. The Lindgren homestead, 20 miles from the nearest neighbour, represents both the promise and the peril of frontier agricultural settlement. Niels Lindgren brought his family from Sweden with dreams of creating a prosperous farm on free government land. but their first winter is testing every assumption they made about their ability to succeed in this new environment. Their cabin is typical of hasty frontier construction. Logs cut green and stacked quickly, chinking done with whatever materials were available, and heating provided by a single fireplace that proves inadequate for the severe cold. The family is learning through bitter experience why so many homestead claims are abandoned after a single winter. Niels's wife, Ingrid, tends their sick baby while trying to manage household tasks that have become exponentially more difficult in the extreme cold. Water freezes solid within hours of being brought inside. Food supplies dwindle faster than anticipated, and the simple act of cooking becomes a complex challenge when fuel must be carefully conserved. Their older children, Gustav, age 14, and Astrid, 12, have matured rapidly under frontier conditions, taking on responsibilities that would be unimaginable for children their age in more civilized settings. Gustav manages the livestock with skill that belies his youth, understanding that the family's survival depends on keeping their animals alive through the winter. Astrid helps her mother with household tasks while caring for her younger siblings with maternal instincts forced to develop early. The Lindgren cabin's inadequacies become more apparent as the storm intensifies. Wind finds gaps in the chinking, creating drafts that make comfortable sleep impossible. The fireplace, built without proper understanding of frontier heating requirements, burns through their carefully hoarded wood supply faster than Niels anticipated. The single room that houses the entire family becomes crowded and smoky as they huddle close to the insufficient fire. But the family's Swedish heritage provides some advantages in dealing with extreme cold. They understand the importance of layered clothing, the value of shared body heat, and the psychological strategies needed to maintain morale through long, dark winters. Ingrid's traditional recipes help stretch food supplies while providing nutrition, and her knowledge of herbal remedies offers some protection against the illnesses that threaten frontier families. The baby's illness adds urgency to every decision the family makes. High fever in an infant can become fatal within hours, but their isolation means that medical help is impossible to obtain. Ingrid relies on traditional remedies passed down through generations of Swedish mothers, but she knows that folk medicine has limitations that could prove fatal in severe cases. Gustav's responsibility for the livestock weighs heavily on his young shoulders. The family's survival depends on their animals making it through the winter, but keeping cattle and horses alive in extreme cold requires skills and resources that are being tested to their limits. He must balance the animals' need for shelter and feed against the family's own requirements, making decisions that adults would find difficult. The storm outside tests every aspect of their homestead's design and construction. Snow piles against the cabin walls, providing some insulation but also creating the risk of structural collapse if accumulation becomes too heavy. Wind drives snow through gaps in the construction that seemed insignificant in good weather, but become critical flaws in a blizzard. Inside the cabin, the family faces the psychological challenges that extreme isolation imposes. They've had no contact with neighbours for weeks, no news from the outside world, no reassurance that anyone knows or cares about their situation. The storm intensifies their isolation to a degree that tests their mental resilience as severely as their physical survival skills. Niels questions the decision that brought his family to this place, wondering whether the promise of free land justifies the risks they're taking with their lives. But retreat isn't an option now. They've invested everything in this homestead claim, and failure would mean not just personal defeat but potential destitution for his entire family. The cabin's single window, covered with oiled paper rather than expensive glass, provides little view of the outside world but serves as a psychological connection to daylight and weather conditions. Tonight, it's completely obscured by snow and frost, cutting off even that tenuous link to the world beyond their walls. Food preparation becomes a complex challenge that requires Ingrid to balance nutrition, fuel conservation, and morale considerations. Every meal must stretch ingredients while providing enough calories to fuel bodies working hard to stay warm. Cooking over the fireplace requires skills that she's still learning, and mistakes can waste precious resources. The children's education continues even in crisis conditions, with Niels conducting lessons by firelight that mix traditional academic subjects with practical survival skills. Learning to read and write remains important for their future prospects, but understanding weather patterns, animal behavior, and resource management might be more immediately crucial for their survival. As the night progresses, the Lindgren family's situation becomes increasingly precarious. Their wood supply dwindles faster than anticipated, forcing difficult decisions about fuel conservation versus maintaining adequate heat. The baby's fever hasn't broken, adding medical urgency to their other challenges, and the storm shows no signs of weakening, raising the possibility that their ordeal might extend well beyond a single night. But frontier families develop resilience that allows them to function effectively even in extreme circumstances. The Lindgrens draw on cultural traditions, family bonds, and sheer determination to face each challenge as it arises. They may not have all the resources they need, but they have each other and the stubborn refusal to surrender that characterizes successful homesteaders. Their story represents thousands of similar dramas playing out across the frontier during winter storms. Families pushed to their limits by circumstances beyond their control, testing their preparation, their skills, and their will to survive. Some will emerge from the experience stronger and better prepared for future challenges. Others will learn that the frontier demands more than they're able to give. The night continues across the prairie, each household facing its own version of the survival challenge, each family drawing on whatever resources and strategies they possess. The storm doesn't discriminate based on preparation or virtue. It tests everyone equally, revealing both strengths and weaknesses that might otherwise remain hidden. Miles away from any of these shelters, a different kind of survival story unfolds. Running Bear, a Lakota warrior, has been caught by the storm while traveling between camps. But his response to the crisis reflects generations of accumulated knowledge about surviving in harmony with the prairie environment rather than in opposition to it. Instead of fighting the storm, Running Bear uses it. He constructs a snow cave that provides insulation and protection from wind while requiring minimal energy to create. His understanding of snow's properties allows him to build a shelter that's actually warmer than many of the wooden structures that settlers labor to create. His clothing, made from buffalo hide and fur, provides insulation that European-style garments can't match. Layers trap warm air while allowing moisture to escape, preventing the dampness that can make even warm clothing become dangerously cold. His moccasins, stuffed with grass and lined with fur, keep his feet warm and dry in conditions that would quickly cause frostbite in conventional boots. Running Bear's survival kit consists of items that reflect deep understanding of winter travel requirements. Flint and steel for fire making, dried meat that provides concentrated nutrition, and herbs that can treat illness or injury. But more importantly, he carries knowledge, understanding of weather patterns, snow conditions, and emergency shelter construction that no amount of manufactured equipment can replace. His approach to the storm illustrates a fundamental difference in philosophy between indigenous and European approaches to frontier survival. Where settlers often try to impose their will on the environment through technology and construction, native peoples tend to work with natural forces, using them rather than fighting them. The snow cave that Running Bear constructs in less than an hour provides better insulation than the Lindgren cabin that took weeks to build. His understanding of wind patterns allows him to position the shelter for maximum protection with minimal effort. His knowledge of snow density helps him create walls that will support their own weight without collapse. Inside his shelter, Running Bear maintains body heat through techniques that require no external fuel source. Controlled breathing, muscle tension exercises, and mental focus allow him to generate and conserve warmth that people dependent on fires might waste. His ability to enter a meditative state helps pass time while conserving energy. But even with superior survival skills, Running Bear faces real dangers from the storm. His situation would become critical if he were injured or if the storm continued for multiple days. His success depends on the same factors that challenge all frontier survivors: adequate supplies, physical stamina, mental resilience, and the ability to make good decisions under pressure. His story represents the deep knowledge base that indigenous peoples developed over centuries of plains living, knowledge that many settlers dismissed as primitive while struggling with problems that native techniques could easily solve. The tragic irony is that this accumulated wisdom was often ignored by people who desperately needed it. As dawn approaches across the storm-swept prairie, each of these survival stories reaches its climax. The Mitchell family in their cabin, the emergency shelter communities in the store and church, the Morrison family in their dugout, the struggling Lindgren homestead, and Running Bear in his snow cave all face the final test of making it through the longest, coldest hours before sunrise. The storm itself begins to show signs of weakening as the night wears on. Wind gusts become less frequent and less violent. Snow continues to fall, but without the driving force that turned it into a deadly weapon earlier in the night. These changes are subtle, barely noticeable to people focused on immediate survival needs, but they represent the difference between disaster and deliverance. In the Mitchell cabin, Thomas adds what might be their last log to the fire and realizes that they've made it. The wind no longer rattles the walls with life-threatening force. The temperature has stabilized at a level that's merely uncomfortable rather than dangerous. His family sleeps fitfully but safely, wrapped in their layers of hides and quilts, breathing the smoky but life-sustaining air of their small sanctuary. Sarah wakes as dawn light begins to filter through the frost-covered window, and she knows they've survived another night. The ritual of mourning will begin soon, rebuilding the fire, warming clothes, preparing food, and beginning another day of frontier life. But they've proven once again that determination, preparation, and mutual support can overcome even the prairie winter's worst efforts. The children wake slowly, reluctant to leave their warm nest but eager to see what the storm has left behind. Timothy's stones have cooled, but his small body has generated enough heat through the night to keep frostbite at bay. Mary traces new patterns in the frost that has accumulated on the windows, creating temporary art that will melt with the morning's warmth. Martha stirs the banked coals back to flame and begins the careful process of bringing the cabin back to full life. Coffee goes on the fire first, thin and bitter, but warm and caffeinated. Breakfast will be simple but adequate. Cornbread baked in a Dutch oven, preserved meat, and milk if it hasn't frozen solid overnight. The store community wakes to the smell of coffee and the sound of Margaret organizing the morning meal from their pooled resources. The travellers who sought shelter will need to assess travel conditions and decide whether to continue their journeys or wait for further improvement in the weather. The homesteaders whose cabin collapsed will need to make plans for rebuilding or finding alternative shelter. Walter the medicine peddler inventories his remaining supplies and considers what this experience might mean for his business. Tom the equipment salesman calculates the cost of the catalogues and papers he burned for fuel and weighs it against the value of his life. Samuel the bookseller looks at his reduced inventory and feels the complex emotions of someone who has sacrificed treasured possessions for survival. In the church, Reverend Williams leads morning prayers that focus on gratitude for survival and strength for the challenges ahead. The community that formed overnight around shared vulnerability will soon disperse back to individual lives and concerns, but bonds have been created that will influence the settlement's social dynamics for months or years to come. Dr. Harrison makes final rounds among the shelter residents, checking for any medical issues that developed during the night and providing advice for dealing with the aftermath of exposure to extreme conditions. His role as community physician extends beyond treating illness to helping people understand how to protect their health in an environment that offers constant challenges. The Kowalski family prepares to return to their small house, but Mrs. Kowalski has formed connections with other women that will persist beyond the emergency. Language barriers that seemed insurmountable yesterday have proven less important than shared experiences and mutual support. In the Morrison dugout, the family wakes to the steady warmth that their earth-sheltered home provides even in extreme conditions. Their survival strategy has proven its worth once again, reinforcing James's belief that working with the environment rather than against it offers the best hope for long-term success on the frontier. Catherine begins breakfast preparations with ingredients stored in their root cellar, marveling once again at how effective the underground storage system proves to be. The children help with practiced efficiency, their routine undisturbed by the storm that created crisis conditions for less well-prepared families. The dugout's success represents more than just smart construction techniques. It reflects a philosophy of frontier life that prioritizes long-term sustainability over short-term convenience, that values harmony with natural conditions over imposing foreign standards, that seeks security through understanding rather than domination. The Lindgren homestead faces mourning with mixed results from their survival efforts. The family has made it through the night, but not without cost. The baby's fever has finally broken, but their wood supply is critically low. The cabin has held together, but gaps in construction have been revealed that must be addressed before the next storm. Niels faces decisions that will determine his family's prospects for surviving the remainder of the winter. Their experience has taught harsh lessons about the difference between theoretical preparation and practical reality. They must either learn from these lessons quickly or face the possibility of becoming another statistic in the high failure rate of frontier homesteading. Ingrid tends to her baby with relief and exhaustion, knowing that they've survived this crisis but that others will surely follow. Her confidence in traditional remedies has been reinforced, but she's also learned the limitations of folk medicine when dealing with serious illness in isolation. Gustav checks on the livestock with the mature understanding that their survival depends on the animals making it through the winter. His night of worry about cattle and horses has taught him lessons about animal husbandry that will serve him throughout his life, if he and his family succeed in establishing themselves on the frontier. Running Bear emerges from his snow cave with the calm competence of someone whose survival skills have been tested and proven adequate. His techniques have once again demonstrated their effectiveness, but he also understands that overconfidence can be as dangerous as inadequate preparation. The storm has reminded him that even superior skills must be matched with respect for the power of natural forces. His success represents generations of accumulated knowledge about living with rather than against the prairie environment. But it also illustrates the tragedy of cultural knowledge being lost, as traditional ways of life are displaced by settlement patterns that ignore rather than learn from indigenous expertise. As full daylight reveals the storm's aftermath, each survival story resolves into lessons learned, relationships changed, and preparations made for future challenges. The prairie winter has tested everyone according to their circumstances and capabilities, revealing both strengths and weaknesses that will influence future success or failure. The snow lies deep across the landscape, transforming familiar landmarks into alien terrain. Drifts have buried fences, covered roads, and reshaped the very geography of human settlement. Travel will be impossible for days, isolation will continue, and the work of digging out will require the same community cooperation that enabled survival during the storm itself. But the sun shines brightly on the white landscape, promising warmth that will eventually come, spring that will surely follow, and hope that justifies the struggles of frontier life. The people who have survived this night have proven their worthiness to claim a place in this harsh but magnificent country. The stories of this single winter night represent thousands of similar experiences that collectively tell the tale of how the American frontier was really won, not through gunfights and gold rushes, but through the quiet heroism of ordinary people refusing to surrender to impossible conditions, supporting each other through crisis, and finding the strength to begin again each morning. Their legacy lives in every warm home, every secure community, every act of neighbourly support that characterises the regions they settled. The comfort we enjoy today was built by people who learned to find warmth in the coldest darkness, safety in the most dangerous circumstances, and hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Sleep well in your warm beds, remembering that your comfort was earned by those who faced the storm with nothing but determination and each other. Let their courage warm your dreams and carry their lesson forward, that human beings, when tested by nature's worst, don't just endure, they create the foundations of civilization itself, one long winter night at a time. But before we close this tale of survival and endurance, there are more stories to tell from that long frontier night. Stories that reveal the full spectrum of human experience when faced with nature's most brutal test. Let me take you deeper into the darkness, where other families fought their own battles against the relentless cold. 25 miles northeast of the settlement, the O'Brien trading post represents another kind of frontier survival story. Patrick O'Brien came west not as a farmer or miner, but as a trader, understanding that the frontier's success depended as much on commerce as on agriculture. His post serves travellers, trappers, and scattered homesteaders across a territory the size of several eastern states. Tonight, the trading post has become an unintended refuge for a diverse group of frontier travellers caught by the storm. The building itself is larger and more substantial than most frontier structures, built for business rather than simple family shelter, with thick log walls, multiple rooms, and a large central fireplace designed to accommodate groups of customers during the trading season. Patrick moves through his establishment with the practiced efficiency of a man who has learned that hospitality can be a matter of life and death on the frontier. His guests tonight include a group of fur trappers heading back to civilization with their winter's catch, a family of German immigrants searching for relatives who homesteaded somewhere in the territory, a circuit judge travelling between remote settlements, and a mysterious woman who claims to be a widow seeking her late husband's claim. The trappers, Bill Grizzly Morrison, Jean-Baptiste Dubois, and Tom Silent Williams, represent the frontier's most independent spirits. These men spend months alone in the wilderness, living off their knowledge of animal behaviour, weather patterns, and survival techniques that make even the hardiest homesteaders look like tenderfoots. But even they respect the kind of storm that's raging outside tonight. Bill Morrison earned his nickname not from any resemblance to the animal, but from his legendary encounter with an actual grizzly bear that left him scarred but alive. Tonight, he shares stories of winter survival that make the settlers' struggles seem almost comfortable by comparison. He speaks of nights spent buried in snow caves, of hunting for food when supplies ran out, of times when the only thing standing between him and death was his knowledge of how to read the wilderness. Jean-Baptiste represents the French-Canadian voyageur tradition that helped open much of the northern frontier. His knowledge of winter travel comes from generations of fur traders who learned to work with rather than against the harsh conditions. He carries equipment and techniques passed down through families that have made their living in the wilderness since before the United States existed as a nation. Tom Williams earns his nickname from his habit of going days without speaking when he's in the woods. But tonight the enforced sociability of the shelter loosens his tongue. His stories reveal a man who has chosen the solitary life of a trapper, not from misanthropy, but from a deep love of wilderness that civilized life can't satisfy. His survival skills have been honed by years of depending on no one but himself. The German family, Heinrich and Greta Zimmermann with their 3 children, represents another common frontier story. They've come to America with dreams of reuniting with relatives who preceded them, but the vastness of the frontier and the primitive state of communication make finding specific people extraordinarily difficult. They've been travelling for weeks, following rumours and outdated information, searching for family members who may have moved, died, or simply vanished into the immensity of the Western Territories. Heinrich speaks limited English, but his skills as a clockmaker translate surprisingly well to frontier life. His precise, methodical approach to problem-solving has helped his family survive the journey better than many more experienced travellers. He understands mechanical principles that apply to everything from wagon repair to fire management, and his tools, carefully preserved from his former trade, serve unexpected purposes in frontier survival. Greta's experience as a baker's daughter provides knowledge that proves invaluable on the frontier. She understands food preservation, nutrition, and the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into satisfying meals. Her ability to make bread from minimal ingredients, to stretch meat supplies with creative cooking, and to maintain her family's health through careful attention to diet has kept them in better condition than many frontier travellers. Their children, Klaus, age 16, Anna, 14, and little Wilhelm, just 8, have adapted to frontier life with the resilience of youth. Klaus has become skilled at animal handling and basic mechanical repairs. Anna helps her mother with cooking and caring for Wilhelm, while learning the complex skills that frontier women need to master. Wilhelm, despite his youth, has developed the observation skills and physical toughness that frontier life demands. The circuit judge, Honourable Marcus Thornfield, brings a different perspective to the trading post's emergency shelter. His job requires him to travel between widely scattered settlements, holding court in whatever buildings are available, dispensing justice in a land where law enforcement is sparse and legal precedents are still being established. He's seen every aspect of frontier life, from its most noble expressions to its darkest failures. Judge Thornfield carries with him not just law books and legal documents, but stories of how justice works, or fails to work, in a land where traditional social structures don't exist. His presence in the trading post tonight provides a reminder that the frontier isn't just about individual survival, but about creating the social institutions that allow civilization to take root in the wilderness. The mysterious woman, who gives her name only as Mrs. Catherine Black, claims to be searching for her late husband's mining claim somewhere in the territory. But the trappers suspect there's more to her story than she's revealing. A woman travelling alone on the frontier is unusual enough to attract attention, and her expensive clothing and refined manners suggest a background that doesn't quite match her stated circumstances. Patrick O'Brien watches his diverse group of guests with the careful attention of someone who has learned that managing different personalities in close quarters requires diplomatic skills as important as any survival technique. His trading post depends on maintaining good relationships with everyone who might need his services, from the roughest trapper to the most refined Easterner seeking Western investments. The trading post's interior reflects its commercial purpose, while adapting to its current role as emergency shelter. The main room, normally used for displaying goods and conducting business, has been rearranged to accommodate sleeping areas. Shelves of trade goods, bolts of cloth, metal tools, preserved foods, and other items that frontier people need but can't manufacture themselves, now serve as windbreaks and privacy screens. The fireplace, built large enough to accommodate groups of customers during business hours, provides heat adequate for the current emergency situation. But managing the fire through the night requires cooperation among people who don't necessarily trust each other, creating social dynamics that test Patrick's abilities as both host and diplomat. Food becomes a complex negotiation as the night progresses. The trading post's inventory includes preserved foods and other supplies, but Patrick must balance his commercial interests against his humanitarian obligations. The trappers carry their own supplies but are willing to share in exchange for shelter. The German family has limited resources but offers services in exchange for food. Judge Thornfield carries official weight that might influence future business relationships. Mrs. Black hints at financial resources that could compensate Patrick for his hospitality. The result is a careful dance of negotiation that reflects the frontier's complex economy, where money, goods, services, and social relationships all serve as currency depending on circumstances. Patrick's success as a trader depends on his ability to navigate these relationships while maintaining his reputation for fair dealing. As the night deepens, the trading post becomes a microcosm of frontier society dealing with crisis. The trappers share knowledge about wilderness survival that could benefit the other travelers. The German family contributes practical skills that help manage the shelter's daily operations. Judge Thornfield provides leadership and conflict resolution when tensions arise. Mrs. Black, despite her mysterious background, helps care for the children and assists with domestic tasks, but tensions exist beneath the surface cooperation. The trappers view the German immigrants with the mixture of sympathy and condescension that experienced frontier people often feel toward newcomers. The judge represents government authority that many frontier people regard with suspicion. Mrs. Black's secretive nature creates unease among people who depend on knowing whom they can trust. Patrick must manage these tensions while dealing with practical challenges that test his resources and diplomatic skills. The trading post's supplies are substantial but not unlimited. Space is adequate but not comfortable. Heat is sufficient but requires constant attention. The situation works for a single night but would become increasingly problematic if extended. The conversations that develop during the night watches reveal the complex motivations that bring people to the frontier. The trappers speak of freedom from social constraints, of the satisfaction of living by their own skills, of wilderness experiences that civilized life can't provide. But they also reveal loneliness, uncertainty about the future, and awareness that their way of life is threatened by the advancing settlement. Heinrich talks about the dreams that brought his family to America, dreams of land ownership, economic opportunity and social mobility that the old country couldn't provide. But he also admits fears about whether they can succeed in such a different environment, whether their skills will prove adequate, whether they can find the relatives who were supposed to provide support and guidance. Judge Thornfield discusses the challenges of establishing legal institutions in a land where traditional authority structures don't exist. He speaks of trying to balance justice with frontier practicalities, of adapting Eastern legal principles to Western conditions, of the difficulty of enforcing laws when the nearest peace officers might be hundreds of miles away. Mrs. Black reveals little about her personal circumstances, but her knowledge of mining claims, property law and business practices suggests a background more complex than her widow's story explains. Her presence adds mystery to the trading post's temporary community, while contributing practical skills that help the group function effectively. The children adapt to the unusual circumstances with remarkable flexibility, finding ways to entertain themselves and contribute to the group's welfare. Klaus Zimmermann helps the trappers with equipment maintenance, learning wilderness skills that could prove valuable for his family's future. Anna assists the adults with cooking and organizing while learning from Mrs. Black about social graces that frontier life often neglects. Little Wilhelm becomes the group's unofficial mascot, his innocent questions and observations providing moments of humor that help relieve the tension of their confined situation. His resilience and adaptability illustrate the way frontier children develop characteristics that serve them throughout their lives. The trading post's transformation from commercial space to emergency shelter illustrates the flexibility that frontier institutions must possess to survive. Buildings, like people, must serve multiple functions when resources are scarce and needs are many. Tonight, Patrick's business becomes a lifeline for travelers who might otherwise perish in the storm. As dawn approaches, the diverse group of shelter seekers faces decisions about their next moves. The trappers must decide whether to continue their journey or wait for better weather. The German family must choose between pushing forward in their search for relatives or settling temporarily until conditions improve. Judge Thornfield has a court schedule to maintain, but travel might be impossible for days. Mrs. Black's plans remain mysterious, but she too must adapt to circumstances beyond her control. Patrick faces his own decisions about how to balance his commercial interests with his humanitarian obligations. The night's shelter has cost him supplies and potential business, but it has also created relationships that could prove valuable for future trade. His reputation for reliability and hospitality could bring customers, but only if he survives the economic cost of providing emergency services. The storm outside shows signs of weakening as the night progresses, but its aftermath will create new challenges for everyone. Travel will be difficult or impossible until roads can be cleared. Communication with distant locations will remain disrupted. The isolated communities and homesteads that depend on traders like Patrick for essential supplies will face shortages until normal commerce can resume. But the human connections formed during the emergency will persist beyond the immediate crisis. the trappers have gained respect for the German family's resourcefulness and determination. Heinrich and Greta have learned survival techniques from people whose knowledge could prove invaluable. Judge Thornfield has seen examples of frontier cooperation that inform his understanding of how justice works in practice rather than theory. Mrs. Black remains an enigma, but her contributions to the group's welfare have earned grudging acceptance even from those who suspect her motives. Whatever her real story, she has proven herself capable of functioning effectively in frontier conditions, suggesting that her background includes experiences that her refined appearance might not reveal. Meanwhile, in another part of the territory, a different kind of survival story unfolds at the Carlson lumber camp. The camp represents one of the frontier's first industries, harvesting the timber that will become the cabins, barns, and businesses of expanding settlement. But tonight, the men who cut trees for a living find themselves depending on those same trees for survival. The lumber camp's bunkhouse is a long, low building designed to house 20 men in conditions that prioritize economy over comfort. Double bunks line the walls, with a central aisle and a large wood stove providing the only heat for the entire structure. The building's construction reflects its temporary nature: rough lumber, minimal insulation, and utilitarian design that focuses on function rather than comfort. But tonight, the bunkhouse's limitations become potentially fatal flaws. The single stove, adequate for normal winter conditions, struggles to heat the large space when outside temperatures drop to life-threatening levels. Gaps in the construction that provide ventilation during normal weather become sources of dangerous drafts when winter winds reach extreme velocity. The crew represents the international character of frontier labor. Swedish immigrants like Olaf Larsson bring old-world experience with timber cutting and winter survival. Irish workers like Sean O'Malley carry knowledge of hard physical labor and group cooperation developed in very different circumstances. German craftsmen like Hans Müller contribute precision and mechanical skills that improve efficiency and safety. Native-born Americans like camp foreman Jake Thompson bring knowledge of local conditions and business practices, but they're often learning wilderness survival techniques from immigrant workers whose old-world backgrounds included harsher winters and more primitive living conditions. The mix of skills and knowledge creates a workforce that's more adaptable and resilient than any single cultural group might be. The camp's food supplies reflect the economics of feeding working men in remote locations. Beans, salt pork, hardtack, and coffee provide nutrition adequate for heavy physical labor, but minimal variety or freshness. Cooking facilities are basic. A large stove that serves for both heating and food preparation, with minimal equipment for preparing meals that must feed 20 men efficiently. Tonight, these limitations create challenges that test the crew's resourcefulness. Food must be rationed to ensure supplies last until the storm passes and supply wagons can reach the camp. Cooking fuel must be balanced against heating needs, creating difficult decisions about comfort versus sustenance. Water sources may freeze, requiring men to melt snow for drinking and cooking. The social dynamics of the lumber camp under emergency conditions reveal both the strengths and tensions of frontier industrial labor. Men who work together effectively during normal operations may clash when confined in close quarters with limited resources. Ethnic and cultural differences that seem unimportant during busy work periods can become sources of conflict when stress levels rise. Jake Thompson's leadership skills face their severest test as he tries to maintain crew morale and discipline while dealing with conditions that push everyone to their limits. His authority comes from his knowledge of logging operations and his relationship with the company owners. But crisis leadership requires different skills than normal work supervision. The camp's isolation adds psychological pressure to the physical challenges of surviving the storm. Unlike town dwellers who can see lights in neighbours' windows or homesteaders who know their families are nearby, the lumber crew faces the knowledge that they're completely on their own. The nearest help is days away even in good weather, and the storm makes rescue impossible until conditions improve. But the crew's experience with dangerous work creates advantages that other frontier people might lack. These men are accustomed to depending on each other for safety, to working effectively as a team under pressure, to maintaining equipment and supplies in remote locations. Their daily work requires the kind of cooperation and mutual dependence that emergency situations demand. The tools of their trade become survival equipment when circumstances require adaptation. Axes and saws designed for cutting timber serve for processing firewood with efficiency that other frontier people can't match. Block and tackle systems used for moving heavy logs can be adapted for moving supplies or clearing snow. The camp's maintenance tools and spare parts provide resources for solving problems that might prove insurmountable with less equipment. The lumber camp's horses and oxen face their own survival challenges that directly affect the crew's prospects. These animals represent major investments for the logging company, but more immediately, they're essential for hauling logs, supplies, and men when normal operations resume. Keeping working animals alive through extreme weather requires knowledge, resources, and constant attention that compete with human survival needs. The camp's veterinarian knowledge comes primarily from workers who have experience with farm animals, but caring for working stock in extreme conditions requires expertise that may exceed the crew's capabilities. Decisions about fodder rationing, shelter allocation, and medical care for sick animals become matters that could determine the camp's economic survival, as well as the immediate welfare of horses and oxen. As the night progresses, the lumber camp faces cascading challenges that test every aspect of their preparation and resourcefulness. The bunkhouse heating system proves inadequate, forcing men to share bunks and pile on every available blanket and spare clothing. Food preparation becomes difficult when water sources freeze and cooking fuel must be conserved for heating. The camp's latrine facilities, barely adequate under normal conditions, become sources of serious health risk when extreme cold makes normal sanitation procedures dangerous or impossible. Men must balance basic human needs against the risk of frostbite or exposure, creating situations that would be merely uncomfortable under normal circumstances but become potentially fatal in extreme weather. Communication with the outside world ceases completely when telegraph lines fail and travel becomes impossible. The crew faces the psychological challenge of isolation, combined with uncertainty about how long their ordeal might continue. Unlike farmers who can estimate food supplies based on family size, or merchants who can calculate inventory against customer needs, the lumber crew must guess about duration while managing resources for an unknown period. But frontier industrial workers develop resilience and cooperation skills that serve them well in crisis situations. The crew organizes itself into work details that share responsibilities for fuel gathering, food preparation, animal care, and maintaining essential equipment. Leadership emerges based on expertise rather than formal authority, with different men taking charge of different aspects of survival operations. The camp's social hierarchy adapts to emergency conditions in ways that reveal both democratic and authoritarian tendencies. Foreman Jake Thompson retains overall authority, but specialists like Hans Mueller take leadership roles in their areas of expertise. ethnic and cultural differences become less important than individual skills and willingness to contribute to group survival, the lumber camp's experience illustrates how frontier industrial operations must balance economic efficiency against survival preparedness. The company's investment in equipment, supplies, and facilities reflects calculations about normal operating conditions, but extreme weather events test whether those calculations include adequate safety margins for worker survival. The men's wages, paid partly in cash and partly in company store credit, reflect the economic relationships that tie industrial workers to frontier capitalism. But tonight, those economic relationships matter less than the immediate challenge of keeping 20 men alive until morning. The storm doesn't distinguish between workers and owners, between profitable and unprofitable operations, between efficient and inefficient businesses. As dawn approaches at the lumber camp, the crew faces decisions about resuming operations versus continuing emergency procedures. Tree cutting requires coordination and precision that may be impossible if men are weakened by cold and inadequate rest. Equipment may be damaged by extreme weather, creating safety hazards that could prove fatal in normal operations. The horses and oxen that survived the night may be in no condition for heavy work, forcing delays that cost the company money while creating pressure to resume operations before conditions are safe. Jake Thompson must balance company expectations against worker safety, economic pressure against human survival, efficiency against prudence. The camp's experience will influence future preparations for extreme weather, creating knowledge that could prevent similar crises, but also costs that the company may or may not be willing to absorb. The lumber industry's success on the frontier depends on balancing risks against profits, worker welfare against investor returns, immediate survival against long-term profitability. Far from the lumber camp in the territorial capital, a different kind of frontier survival story unfolds. The town of Madison represents the frontier's attempt to recreate Eastern civilization in Western conditions, with government buildings, established businesses, and social institutions that mirror those of older communities. But tonight, even the territorial capital faces challenges that test its claims to civilization and security. Governor William Patterson stands at the window of his official residence, watching snow pile against buildings that were designed to impress visitors with the territory's stability and progress. The governor's mansion, built to Eastern architectural standards with proper heating and substantial construction, provides better protection than most frontier buildings. But it also represents the gap between frontier aspirations and frontier realities. The territorial government employs dozens of people, clerks, administrators, judges, and various officials, who represent the beginning of bureaucratic institutions that established states take for granted. But tonight, these representatives of governmental authority face the same survival challenges as the most isolated homesteader, reminding everyone that civilization on the frontier remains tentative and fragile. The town's businesses, a hotel, several saloons, general stores, a newspaper office, and various shops, provide services that distinguish Madison from simple frontier settlements. But the storm tests whether these businesses can maintain operations when transportation fails, communication ceases, and customers can't reach their establishments. The hotel, run by Charles and Margaret Stevens, becomes an emergency shelter for travelers stranded by the storm. But unlike rural trading posts or general stores, the hotel's commercial operation depends on providing comfort and service, rather than simple survival necessities. The Stevens must balance their business obligations against emergency humanitarian needs, while managing resources that weren't calculated for extended crisis operations. The newspaper office, operated by editor Samuel Wright, faces the challenge of gathering and disseminating information when normal communication channels fail. The weekly paper serves scattered communities across a territory larger than many eastern states, providing news, advertising, and social connection that isolated frontier people desperately need. But tonight, Mr. Wright can neither gather news nor distribute papers, illustrating the fragility of information networks that more established regions take for granted. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell represents one of the frontier's rarest resources, a trained physician with formal medical education rather than folk knowledge or apprentice training. Her presence in Madison reflects the territorial government's effort to attract professional services that can support both government operations and community development. But tonight, her medical skills are tested by conditions that formal training may not have addressed. The territorial prison, a substantial stone building designed to house criminals from across the region, faces its own crisis as the storm tests security procedures designed for normal conditions. Warden Michael O'Connor must balance prisoner security against guard safety, institutional discipline against emergency cooperation, establish procedures against unprecedented circumstances. The town's churches, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Catholic, represent different approaches to frontier spirituality, but tonight serve similar functions as emergency shelters and community gathering places. Each congregation faces decisions about opening their buildings to anyone who needs shelter versus maintaining normal social and religious boundaries. Madison's small but growing business district reflects the optimism of frontier capitalism, with establishments that serve not just immediate survival needs, but longer-term economic development. A small bank, a law office, a surveyor's business, and various specialty shops represent the infrastructure of commerce that distinguishes towns from mere settlements. But tonight, these symbols of economic progress face the same fundamental challenge that confronts every frontier enterprise: survival in conditions that test every assumption about what constitutes adequate preparation. The bank's vault may be secure against robbery, but it provides no protection against the economic disruption that extreme weather creates. The law officer's library of legal precedents and territorial statutes may establish the framework for justice and property rights, but tonight those books serve mainly as fuel for fires if heating systems fail. The surveyor's maps and instruments may define property boundaries and town plats, but they can't ensure that the community they describe will survive until spring. As the night progresses, Madison's residents discover that frontier civilization requires constant vigilance and mutual support rather than institutional structures alone. The governor's authority matters less than his ability to coordinate emergency response. The hotel's luxury amenities matter less than its capacity to shelter people. The newspaper's information gathering matters less than its editor's skill at organizing community cooperation. Dr. Hartwell finds herself treating not just medical emergencies but serving as community advisor on health measures that prevent crisis situations from becoming disasters. Her knowledge of nutrition, sanitation, and disease prevention proves more valuable than her surgical skills or pharmaceutical supplies. The prison's security procedures adapt to emergency conditions in ways that reveal both the necessity and limitations of institutional authority. Prisoners and guards alike face the same survival challenges, creating temporary cooperation that transcends normal institutional boundaries while maintaining essential security requirements. the churches discover that their role as community focal points becomes more important than their specific doctrinal differences. Tonight, theological disputes matter less than practical cooperation in providing shelter, organizing food distribution, and maintaining morale among people facing life-threatening conditions. Madison's business community learns that economic relationships built on normal market conditions require adaptation when survival takes precedence over profit. Merchants share resources that they would normally sell, professionals provide services without regard for payment, and property owners open buildings for emergency use regardless of liability concerns. The town's social hierarchy, based on wealth, education, and official position under normal circumstances, yields to emergency leadership based on practical skills and willingness to serve community needs. The governor retains formal authority, but his decisions depend on advice from people whose knowledge of local conditions and survival techniques may exceed his own. As dawn approaches in Madison, the territorial capital faces questions about what frontier civilization means when tested by extreme conditions. The buildings, institutions, and social structures that distinguish the town from simpler settlements have provided some advantages, but survival has ultimately depended on the same factors that determine success or failure in isolated homesteads: preparation, cooperation, resourcefulness, and mutual support. The storm's aftermath will test whether Madison's claims to represent stable civilization can withstand the economic and social disruption that extreme weather creates. Government operations must resume despite damaged communication and transportation networks. Businesses must reopen despite depleted supplies and uncertain customer access. Social institutions must function despite the emergency measures that temporarily suspended normal procedures. The territorial capital's experience illustrates the challenges facing all frontier communities as they attempt to build lasting institutions in an environment that regularly tests every assumption about security and stability. Success requires balancing aspirations for Eastern standards with acceptance of Western realities, planning for normal growth with preparation for emergency survival, individual achievement with community cooperation. But perhaps the most remarkable survival story of this long frontier night unfolds in a place where few would expect to find human habitation at all. High in the mountains that form the territory's western boundary, a small mining camp clings to existence in conditions that make even the harshest prairie settlement seem comfortable by comparison. The Silverton mining camp represents frontier capitalism at its most extreme. Men willing to endure incredible hardships for the possibility of striking it rich in precious metals. The camp's location, chosen for proximity to promising ore deposits rather than habitability, creates survival challenges that go beyond anything that farmers, merchants, or even loggers typically face. At nearly 9,000 feet above sea level, the camp exists in an environment where winter temperatures regularly drop far below anything recorded on the prairie, where snow falls from September through May, where the thin air makes every physical effort more difficult than it would be at lower altitudes. The men who work here represent either desperate fortune seekers or individuals so confident in their survival skills that they're willing to bet their lives on the possibility of wealth. The camp's buildings reflect the harsh economics of high-altitude mining operations. Everything must be hauled up narrow mountain trails by pack animals or human labor, making every board, every nail, every piece of equipment precious beyond normal frontier standards. Construction techniques focus on immediate necessity rather than comfort, creating structures that provide barely adequate shelter against conditions that regularly prove fatal to the unprepared. The bunkhouse that serves as home for 15 miners is built with double walls filled with sawdust for insulation, but even this substantial construction struggles against temperatures that can drop to 40 degrees below zero. The building's single stove, fired constantly throughout the winter months, consumes wood at a rate that requires one man's full-time labor just to maintain fuel supplies. Tonight, as the storm that affects the entire territory reaches the high mountains, the mining camp faces conditions that push survival skills to their absolute limits. Wind speeds that seem fierce on the prairie become potentially lethal at high altitude, where thin air provides less resistance to atmospheric motion. Snow that creates travel difficulties at lower elevations becomes a suffocating avalanche threat in mountain terrain. The miners themselves represent a unique subset of frontier population, men tough enough to survive conditions that would defeat most people, but also individuals whose pursuit of wealth has led them to accept risks that more prudent people would reject. Their survival skills have been honed by experiences that make normal frontier hardships seem trivial, but they're also gambling their lives on the hope that current suffering will lead to future prosperity. Joe Mountain Morrison, no relation to the other Morrisons scattered across our frontier night, serves as camp foreman by virtue of his 5 years' experience in high-altitude mining and his uncanny ability to predict weather changes that can mean the difference between life and death at 9,000 feet. His knowledge of mountain survival comes from hard experience with conditions that don't permit learning from mistakes. The crew includes men from as far away as Cornwall, England, where generations of miners developed techniques for working in dangerous underground conditions. These Cornish miners, known as Cousin Jacks, bring knowledge of tunnel construction, explosive handling, and team coordination that proves invaluable in mountain mining operations. But their experience with underground work doesn't necessarily prepare them for the surface survival challenges that high-altitude winters create. Mexican miners like Carlos Valdez contribute knowledge of high-altitude conditions developed in their homeland's mountain regions. But Colorado's winter weather exceeds anything that temperate Mexico experiences. Their understanding of how thin air affects physical performance and their techniques for working in steep terrain prove valuable. But they too must adapt their knowledge to conditions more extreme than anything in their previous experience. The camp's supply situation represents logistics challenges that make normal frontier isolation seem trivial by comparison. Everything the miners need — food, tools, medicine, clothing, reading material, alcohol — must be packed up narrow mountain trails during the brief summer months when transportation is possible. Winter isolation means 8 months of complete self-sufficiency, with no possibility of resupply until spring. Food preservation at high altitude requires techniques that go beyond normal frontier methods. The thin air and extreme temperature variations create conditions that can spoil some foods while preserving others in unexpected ways. The miners have learned to use natural ice caves for refrigeration, to cure meat using mountain air and salt, and to grow sprouts from stored seeds to provide fresh vegetables during the winter months. Water sources present unique challenges in mountain environments. Springs may freeze solid, making it necessary to melt snow for drinking water. But snow at high altitude often contains less water per volume than prairie snow, meaning that more fuel must be consumed to produce adequate water supplies. Ice formation can block drainage, creating flooding risks when temperatures rise even slightly. The camp's isolation means that medical emergencies become potential death sentences unless the miners can treat problems themselves. The crew includes a former army medic whose battlefield experience provides knowledge of trauma treatment. But high-altitude physiology creates medical challenges that formal military training may not address. Altitude sickness, extreme dehydration, and cold-related injuries require treatment techniques that the miners have had to develop through experience. The psychological challenges of high-altitude winter isolation exceed those faced by any other frontier population. The combination of physical hardship, complete isolation, uncertain economic prospects, and constant life-threatening danger creates mental stress that can break even strong individuals. The miners must support each other's morale while dealing with their own fears and uncertainties. Tonight, as the storm reaches the mountain camp, the miners face their ultimate survival test. Wind speeds that could knock down buildings, snow accumulation that could bury the camp entirely, and temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes combine to create conditions that challenge every aspect of their preparation and skill. The camp's heating system, designed for normal mountain winter conditions, struggles against the storm's intensity. The miners must balance fuel consumption against heat requirements, knowing that their wood supply must last until spring, but also understanding that inadequate heating could prove fatal before morning. They take turns feeding the fire, monitoring temperature changes, and checking the building's structural integrity as wind and snow test every joint and beam. Food rationing becomes critical when the storm threatens to extend their isolation beyond normal winter duration. The miners must calculate consumption rates against uncertain supply prospects, balancing immediate nutritional needs against long-term survival requirements. Their stored food supplies, adequate for normal winter isolation, may prove insufficient if spring weather delays supply pack trains. The camp's equipment and tools, essential for their mining operations but also crucial for survival tasks, must be protected against weather conditions that could damage or destroy items that can't be replaced until spring. The miners spend precious time and energy securing equipment, while also maintaining the heating and shelter systems that keep them alive. Communication with the outside world becomes impossible when telegraph lines fail and mountain passes become impassable. The miners face complete isolation with no possibility of rescue or assistance until weather conditions improve and transportation becomes possible again. They must depend entirely on their own resources and skills, with no margin for error or second chances. But high-altitude mining develops survival skills and mental toughness that serve the miners well in extreme conditions. These men have learned to function effectively when every breath requires conscious effort, when cold metal tools can cause instant frostbite, when a single mistake in judgment can prove fatal. Their daily work environment prepares them for emergency conditions that would overwhelm most people. The miners' international backgrounds provide diverse knowledge bases that combine effectively in crisis situations. Cornish mining techniques, Mexican high-altitude experience, American frontier resourcefulness, and individual skills developed through previous survival experiences create a collective expertise that exceeds what any single cultural tradition could provide. As the night progresses at the mining camp, the crew faces cascading challenges that test every aspect of their preparation and teamwork. The building's heating system proves barely adequate, forcing the men to share bunks and pull their blankets for maximum warmth retention. Cooking becomes difficult when water sources freeze and fuel must be conserved for heating rather than food preparation. The camp's sanitation facilities, minimal under normal conditions, become sources of serious health risk when extreme cold makes normal procedures dangerous or impossible. The miners must balance basic human needs against exposure risks, creating situations that require both physical courage and practical innovation. Equipment maintenance becomes critical when tools and machinery that the miners depend on for both work and survival face stresses that exceed their design limitations. Metal becomes brittle in extreme cold, wood contracts and splits, and mechanical systems that function normally in moderate conditions may fail when tested by temperature extremes. The miners' work schedules, normally organized around mining operations, must adapt to survival priorities that take precedence over gold extraction. Men who usually spend their time underground must focus on surface tasks like fuel gathering, building maintenance, and weather monitoring that determine whether anyone survives to resume mining when conditions improve. But the camp's experience also illustrates the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and cooperation under extreme stress. The miners organize themselves efficiently for survival tasks, share resources without regard for normal ownership considerations, and support each other's morale through humor, storytelling, and shared determination to survive until spring. As dawn approaches at the high-altitude mining camp, the crew faces decisions about whether to continue normal operations or focus entirely on survival until the storm passes. Mining work requires coordination and precision that may be impossible when men are weakened by cold, lack of sleep, and inadequate nutrition. Equipment may be damaged by extreme weather, creating safety hazards that could prove fatal in underground operations. The camp's economic situation adds complexity to survival decisions. The miners' contracts specify work requirements that determine their share of any gold discovered, but survival may require abandoning mining operations for extended periods. Individual miners must balance economic opportunity against personal safety, immediate survival against long-term financial prospects. The mining camp's experience represents frontier capitalism pushed to its absolute limits, men willing to risk everything for the possibility of wealth, testing human endurance against natural forces that respect neither ambition nor courage. Their survival depends not on the gold they hope to find, but on the knowledge, skills, and mutual support that they bring to the challenge of staying alive in one of the continent's most unforgiving environments. As dawn finally breaks across the entire frontier territory, each of these survival stories reaches its conclusion. The storm that tested every community, every family, every individual begins to weaken, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow and ice, but also by the human experiences that this long night has created. From the Mitchell family's cabin to the territorial capital, from the trading post to the mining camp, from the dugout homestead to the lumber camp, the night has tested every assumption about frontier preparedness, every relationship between neighbors, every individual's capacity for endurance and courage. Some will emerge from this experience stronger and better prepared for future challenges. Others will learn harsh lessons about the difference between frontier dreams and frontier realities. Still others will discover capabilities and relationships that they never knew they possessed. The storm doesn't distinguish between rich and poor, experienced and inexperienced, prepared and unprepared. It tests everyone according to their circumstances while teaching lessons about survival that no amount of theoretical preparation can provide. The frontier's ultimate teacher is experience itself, and tonight has provided education that will influence decisions for years to come. But perhaps the most important lesson of this long frontier night is that survival depends not just on individual preparation and courage, but on the networks of mutual support that connect isolated households into communities, scattered settlements into territories, and diverse populations into the emerging society that will eventually become the American West. The warmth we seek isn't just the physical heat that keeps our bodies alive through cold nights, but the human warmth that comes from knowing we're not facing the darkness alone. The strength we need isn't just the individual toughness that endures hardship, but the collective resilience that emerges when people support each other through impossible circumstances. Tonight's stories remind us that the frontier was won not by solitary heroes facing the wilderness alone, but by communities of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary reserves of courage, resourcefulness, and mutual support when survival demanded nothing less than their best efforts. As you settle into your own warm bed tonight, remember that your comfort was earned by people who faced far worse conditions with far fewer resources, who found ways to create warmth and safety and hope in the midst of nature's worst fury, who proved that human beings can endure almost anything when they face it together. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in your past families like these fought the darkness and won, creating the foundation of security and prosperity that allows you to rest easy tonight. Their vigil is ended, but their legacy lives in every comfortable night, every safe home, every community that cares for its members when crisis comes. Let their courage warm your dreams, and remember that every peaceful night you spend is built on the foundation of those who learned to find rest in the midst of the storm, warmth in the depths of cold, and hope in the simple act of keeping the fire burning until dawn.